The air at the Henderson Farm auction hung thick and heavy, a miserable cocktail of late August humidity, diesel fumes, and desperation. It was 1983, and the scent of failure was as plain as the rust on the machinery, lined up in neat, depressing rows. Men who had been neighbors for a generation stood with their hands shoved deep in their pockets, their faces grim, avoiding each other's eyes. They weren't here to buy. They were here to watch a man's life get sold off piece by piece, a public execution of a family's dream. I was there, Frank Miller, leaning against the fender of my old Ford F-250, the one with the primer grey door from a junkyard. I wasn't there to gloat. I was just watching and remembering. The main attraction, the beast that had brought everyone out, was a Steiger Cougar too. It was a monster of a machine, an articulated four-wheel drive with 8 massive tires, each one taller than my son. It was painted that signature lime green, but the paint was faded and peeling, and a long, ugly gash ran down its flank where it had scraped against a grain bin. A chain from a tow truck was still hooked to its frame, a final indignity. The auctioneer, a fast-talking man named Simmons, was trying to work his magic, but the crowd was dead. "All right, folks, what am I bid for this fine piece of American horsepower?" He chirped into his microphone, the sound tinny and false. "A little engine trouble, the bank says, but a man with some know-how could have her purring in no time. Let's start the bidding at 10,000. Do I hear 10? Silence. The only sound was the wind rustling the dry cornstalks in the field next door. The engine trouble was a blown Cummins. Threw a rod right through the side of the block. It wasn't a little trouble, it was a catastrophe. The tractor was scrap metal with a cab on it. Dale Peterson, the owner, stood off to the side, next to a sharp-suited man I recognized as Mr. Harrison from the county trust. Dale looked 10 years older than he had last spring. His face was pale, his shoulders slumped inside a fancy western shirt that now looked 2 sizes too big. He stared at the ground, his jaw working silently. Harrison, on the other hand, looked impatient, tapping a polished wingtip shoe on the dusty ground. His face was a mask of cold arithmetic. This wasn't a farm to him, it was an asset to be liquidated. 5,000 then, Simmons pleaded. Somebody give me 5,000 for this green giant. A scrap dealer from the city, a vulture in a greasy bull cap, finally raised a hand. 1,000. A gasp went through the crowd. A tractor that had cost Dale nearly $100,000 just a few years ago, bought with a handshake and a mountain of bank paper, was being opened at $1,000. Harrison shot the scrapman a look that could curdle milk, but he gave Simmons a curt nod. The bidding crept up in $100 increments, finally stalling out at $2,700. "Sold," Simmons cried, banging a small gavel. "To the man in the greasy cap for $2,700. As the scrap man went to sign the papers, I couldn't help it. My mind drifted back 12 years earlier to another auction on a brighter day. It was 1971. The air was full of optimism then. Corn was climbing, the Russians were buying our grain, and the future felt as wide and open as a freshly plowed field. I was 30 years old, just taking over the 320 acres my dad had carved out of the Iowa soil with his own 2 hands and a farmall M. Dad's rule was simple and unbending. If you can't write a check for it, you don't own it. Debt is a chain, son. The man who holds the note holds the whip. That day, I'd bought myself a tractor. A 1966 John Deere 4020 diesel with the power shift transmission. It wasn't pretty. The green paint was faded to the color of a dull pea, the seat was ripped, and one of the rear fenders had a dent in it the size of a dinner plate. It had over 6,000 hours on the tachometer, and it smoked a little on startup. But I paid $7,000 for it. Cash, money I had saved from selling hogs and working winters for the county road crew. It took every dime I had, but when I drove it home, it was mine. Dale Peterson was there that day too. He was only 24, but he walked with the swagger of a man who'd already conquered the world. His dad had co-signed a note at the bank, and Dale was the proud new owner of a brand new International Harvester 1066, fresh off the showroom floor. It gleamed under the sun, the red paint so bright it hurt your eyes. It had a factory cab with tinted glass, air conditioning, and a radio. It was a spaceship compared to my old Deere. He saw me looking over the 40/20, checking the fluids before I started the long drive home. He sauntered over, kicking one of my tires. "Starting a museum, Frank?" he'd asked, a smirk playing on his lips. "It'll do the work," I said, not looking up from the dipstick. "Maybe," he laughed, "if you've got all summer to do it. You can't farm in the space age with a relic like that. You gotta think bigger. Leverage. That's the name of the game now. The bank is practically giving money away." I just wiped the dipstick on my jeans and slid it back into the big 6-cylinder engine. "I prefer to sleep at night, Dale." He just shook his head and walked away, laughing to his friends about the old-fashioned fool who was trying to farm like his granddaddy. In his mind, and in the minds of most of our neighbors, he was the future. I was the past. Looking back now, standing in the ruins of Dale's future, it makes a man wonder. Was it wisdom that kept me tied to that old iron, that made me fear the banker's smile more than a hailstorm? Or was it just plain dumb luck? I've turned that question over in my mind 1,000 times, grease on my hands, staring at a busted part in the dead of night. Before we go any further with this story, I'd like to know what you think. Drop a comment below and tell me. Was it wisdom that got men like me through the hard times, or were we just the lucky ones who were too stubborn or too scared to change? The years that followed that auction in '71 only seemed to prove Dale right. The early '70s were a boom time. The world was hungry, and we were the breadbasket. Prices for corn and soybeans shot up like a rocket. The government was telling us to plant fence row to fence row, and the banks were happy to fund the expansion. Dale Peterson became the poster child for the new way of farming. While I was out in my fields on my open station 40/20, eating dust in the spring and freezing in the fall, Dale was riding in climate-controlled comfort. The sound of his 1066's screaming turbo was the sound of progress. My old dear just had that classic throaty lug of a naturally aspirated engine. It was a reliable sound, a comforting sound to me, but to everyone else it sounded like stagnation. My life was a cycle of hard work and constant maintenance. Old iron demands respect. You don't just jump on it and go. You check the oil, you check the coolant, you walk around it looking for drips, for loose bolts, for anything that looks out of place. And when it breaks, you fix it. You don't call a dealer and have a service truck show up with a young mechanic who hooks a computer up to it. You get out the wrenches and the manual, and you get to work. I remember one spring the power shift transmission in the 40/20 started acting up. It was slipping in the higher gears, struggling to pull the 16-foot disc through the heavy soil. I knew what it meant. The clutch packs were shot. A trip to the John Deere dealer confirmed my fears. The service manager, a guy I went to high school with, quoted me a price that made my blood run cold. "Probably be $3,000–4,000, Frank. If we can even get the parts, might be time to trade this old girl in." Trade it in? On what? A new tractor would cost more than my whole farm was worth. There was only one option. I had to fix it myself. For the next week, my machine shed became an operating room. The first job was to split the tractor. It's a daunting task. You're basically breaking a 10,000-pound machine in half. I used a heavy-duty rolling floor jack under the transmission housing and stacks of oak blocking under the engine frame. I remember the smell of penetrating oil as I worked on the huge bolts that held the two halves together, bolts that hadn't been turned in 15 years. The sound of the 3/4-inch impact wrench hammering away echoed in the steel building. Finally, with a groan of protesting metal, it came apart. I rolled the front half of the tractor, the engine and front wheels, away from the rear half, leaving the transmission and final drives exposed. It was like open-heart surgery on a giant. I laid the parts out on a clean piece of plywood, following the dog-eared pages of my I&T shop manual. The hydraulic fluid, high guard, dripped onto the dirt floor, smelling hot and metallic. I found the problem. The C2 clutch pack was completely fried. The friction discs were worn down to bare metal. Getting parts meant a trip to Miller's Salvage, a sprawling rusty graveyard of farm machinery 20 miles away. Old man Miller, no relation, had acres of dead and dying tractors. I spent a whole afternoon walking the rows, looking for a 40/20 of the same vintage. I finally found one, half swallowed by weeds, its engine long gone. But the transmission was still there. I paid him $50 and spent 3 hours with a set of wrenches pulling the clutch housing I needed. Back in my shop, I cleaned every part in a bucket of diesel fuel. My hands stained black. I carefully reassembled the clutch pack, soaking the new friction discs in fresh hydraulic fluid, torquing every bolt to spec. The hardest part was putting it all back together, inching the two halves of the tractor back into alignment. It took hours, using a pry bar and a whole lot of swearing, to get the spline shaft to line up perfectly. When it finally slid home with a satisfying thud, I felt a wave of relief so powerful it almost made me dizzy. I was just finishing up, covered in grease and sweat, when I heard the rumble of a big tractor coming down my lane. It was Dale. He was driving a brand new International 1466, even bigger and louder than his 1066. He'd traded up. He pulled up to the shop and killed the engine. The silence that followed was almost deafening. He leaned out of his quiet, air-conditioned cab. "Still playing doctor with that old junk, Frank?" he called out, a grin on his face. "I just finished dissing the Henderson Quarter, all 160 acres. What have you been doing all week?" "Just some maintenance," I said, wiping my hands on a rag. "Looks like more than maintenance," he chuckled. "You know, for what you're spending on parts and your own time, you could be making a payment on a new machine. One that doesn't break down." He revved his engine and the big turbo whistled. "Time is money, Frank. You're wasting both." He put the tractor in gear and drove off, leaving a cloud of dust behind. I just stood there and watched him go. He wasn't wrong about the time. I had lost a whole week of prime tillage weather. A storm was brewing in the west, the sky turning the color of a nasty bruise. I still had 200 acres of corn ground to plant. The breakdown had put me on the very edge of disaster. That night, I didn't sleep. I worked. I bolted the 40i20 back together, filled it with fresh fluids, and hooked up my 6-row John Deere 7000 planter. By midnight, I was in the field. I had a couple of old spotlights rigged up on the fenders, powered by the tractor's electrical system. They cast a weak yellow circle of light in the immense darkness. The wind was picking up, whipping my hat off my head. Rain was coming, and if I didn't get this seed in the ground, my whole year's crop would be in jeopardy. The freshly rebuilt transmission worked flawlessly. The power shift clicked through the gears, smooth as butter. The big diesel engine settled into its familiar, powerful rhythm. It was just me and the machine, moving through the dark, laying down neat rows of seed. The smell of the turned earth, the drone of the engine, the rattle of the planter units. That was my world. I finished the last pass just as the first fat drops of rain began to fall, streaking the dust on the tractor's hood. I was bone-tired, my body ached, but I had won. It was a brutal, lonely victory, but a victory nonetheless. As I drove back to the shed, I knew my neighbors would see my planter tracks in the wet fields the next morning and shake their heads. "That Frank Miller," they'd say at the coffee shop, always flying by the seat of his pants. "One of these days, his luck is going to run out." The mid-70s rolled in, and the boom just kept getting bigger. The price of land doubled, and then doubled again. A new phrase entered the farmer's vocabulary: paper wealth. We were all rich on paper, but cash was still tight. The mantra from the universities and the farm magazines was "get big or get out." The Secretary of Agriculture himself, Earl Butts, was on the radio telling us to expand. It felt like a gold rush. Dale Peterson was the county's star prospector. He rode the wave of easy credit like a champion surfer. After buying the 160 acres next to me, he bought another 320 on the other side. He rented another 1,000. His operation was a sprawling empire of black dirt. The 1466 was soon joined by that massive articulated Steiger, the green monster. He bought a new Gleaner combine with a corn head so wide it had to be escorted down the county roads. His farmstead looked like a dealer's lot. Everything was new, shiny, and big. He was hailed as a genius, a visionary. The local paper did a feature story on him, calling him the farmer of the future. He was on the board at the co-op and was a deacon at his church. When Dale Peterson spoke, people listened. He was the embodiment of the American dream, a testament to what a man could achieve with ambition and a good line of credit. Meanwhile, I kept my head down. I was still farming my 320 acres. I'd added a used John Deere 4430 to my fleet, bought for cash from a retiring farmer, but the old 4020 was still my main workhorse. My equipment was a patchwork of green, red, and blue. All of it old, all of it paid for. I was making good money, the best money of my life. But instead of spending it, I was saving it. I replaced the roof on the barn, I put up a new grain bin, paying the contractor with a check. I was salting it away because my father's words were always in the back of my mind. The 7 fat years are always followed by the 7 lean years. Always. My discipline was seen as eccentricity, or worse, as a lack of ambition, a failure of nerve. Mr. Harrison, the banker, even paid me a personal visit one afternoon. He pulled up in his shiny Buick, a car that cost more than my pickup truck. He found me in the shop, grinding a new edge on the blades of my chisel plow. "Frank," he said, smiling a smile that never reached his eyes, "I was just looking at your financials. You're in a remarkable position." "I pay my bills," I said, not stopping the grinder. Sparks flew and the noise made conversation difficult. I shut it off. "You do more than that," he said, stepping carefully around a grease spot on the floor. "You're debt-free. In this day and age, that's incredible. But Frank, you're not using your assets. This land, it's a gold mine. Corn is over $3 a bushel. With your net worth, I could get you a loan to buy the old Johnson place. We could get you into a new John Deere 4640, a bigger combine. You could easily be farming 1,000 acres within 2 years. I looked at him, a man in a crisp suit standing in my dusty shop, and I saw the lure. I saw the shiny paint and the new cab. I felt the temptation. For a moment I imagined it. Farming without the constant worry of a breakdown, without the long nights spent turning wrenches. Then I looked past him at my old 4020 parked outside. Its paint was faded, but its engine was strong. It owed me nothing. I owed no one for it. I owned it, lock, stock, and barrel. "I appreciate the offer, Mr. Harrison," I said, picking up the grinder again. "But I'm doing all right. I sleep pretty good at night." His smile tightened. "Success favors the bold, Frank. You're leaving a lot of money on the table." He left soon after, and I knew what he was thinking. He was thinking I was a fool. Even my wife, Sarah, had her doubts. She was a good farm wife, patient and hard-working, but she saw the Petersons. She saw Dale's wife, Judy, driving a new station wagon into town, wearing new clothes. She saw them taking a vacation to Florida, something we had only ever dreamed of. "Frank," she said one night as we sat at the kitchen table paying the bills, "are you sure we're doing the right thing? The Petersons just added a new sunroom to their house. Judy has a microwave oven." "Their sunroom is owned by the county trust, Sarah," I told her, signing the check for the electric bill. "So is her microwave. We own our kitchen table. We own the floor under it and the roof over it. That's worth more than a vacation to me." She didn't argue, but I saw the worry in her eyes. It was hard to feel like you were succeeding when, by every visible measure, you were falling further and further behind. Our farm was neat and tidy, but it was a museum. Dale's was a gleaming factory, a model of modern efficiency. The decade started to turn. 1978 became 79. A new feeling was in the air, something uneasy. I'd listened to the radio out in the shop at night, Paul Harvey giving us the rest of the story. There was talk of inflation, of an oil crisis, of hostages in Iran. A man named Paul Volcker was appointed to run the Federal Reserve. He started talking about tightening the money supply, about raising interest rates to fight inflation. Most farmers I knew weren't paying attention. They were too busy trying to get their loans renewed, to buy even more land, even bigger equipment. One cold November evening, I was in the shop doing a final oil change on the 4020 before putting it away for the winter. The wind howled outside, rattling the steel siding. The radio was on, a farm report from Des Moines. The announcer's voice was grim. Interest rates continue their unprecedented climb, with the prime rate hitting a staggering 15% today. Farm economists are warning of a potential credit crunch. 15%. The number hit me like a physical blow. The loans Dale and the others had taken out at 7 or 8% were variable rate loans. I knew that. The bankers had pushed them hard. They were a ticking time bomb. I finished draining the oil, the warm black liquid glugging into the pan. I looked at the price on the new filter I was about to spin on. It had gone up 30% since last year. Everything was going up. Fuel, seed, fertilizer, parts. Everything except the price of corn, which was starting to soften. I stood up and walked to the big sliding door of the shop, pushing it open a few feet. A blast of cold, wet air hit my face. It carried the scent of rain, and something else, the scent of trouble. Across the section, miles away, I could see the yard lights of Dale Peterson's massive operation, a bright cluster of security against the dark, churning sky. It looked like a city, but tonight it didn't look powerful. It looked exposed. The boom felt different now. It felt thin and fragile, like a pane of glass in a hurricane, just waiting for the first stone to hit it. And I had a cold, sinking feeling that the stone had just been thrown. The year 1980 began with a gut punch. President Carter, sitting in his office 1,000 miles away, announced a grain embargo against the Soviet Union. Just like that, with the stroke of a pen, our biggest customer was gone. The bottom fell out of the market. Corn that had been trading north of $3 a bushel plummeted toward $2, and the floor felt a long way off. It was like the world had tilted on its axis. At the coffee shop, the talk was panicked and bitter. Men who had leveraged their entire existence on $3 corn were now staring into a $2 abyss, with no end to the slide in sight. Dale Peterson, however, projected an aura of calm. "It's a temporary political problem," he'd say, stirring cream into his coffee with a steady hand. "The world still needs to eat. We just need to hold on. The strong will survive." But I saw the tightness around his eyes, the slight tremor in his hand when he lifted the cup. His holding on was financed by the county trust at an interest rate that was now climbing past 16%. My holding on was financed by the cash I had in a savings account at the same bank, earning a paltry 5%, but it was mine. That spring, as if on cue, the sky turned against us. It simply stopped raining. The days grew hot and hazy, the sun a merciless white disk in a pale sky. The young corn in my fields, planted in that precious moisture from the spring thaw, began to curl its leaves during the heat of the day, a thirsty plant's desperate sign of distress. The ground cracked open in patterns like old pottery. My old 4020 pulled the 6-row cultivator through the fields, its shovels scraping out the opportunistic weeds that were trying to steal what little water remained. The dust was a constant suffocating presence, a fine brown powder that coated my skin, my clothes, and the back of my throat. One blistering afternoon, I was working the 80 acres that bordered Dale's land. Across the fence row, his Steiger was a lime-green beast against the brown earth, pulling a massive 40-foot field cultivator and covering acres at a mind-boggling speed. But then it stopped. It just sat there in the middle of the field, the big Cummins engine falling silent, an unnatural quiet in the vast open space. I watched for a while as I made my rounds, but it didn't move. A little later, I saw Dale's pickup truck race out to it, followed by the gleaming white service truck from the dealership in the city. 2 mechanics in clean, matching uniforms got out. They spent the rest of the afternoon working on it, their truck a beacon of failure in a sea of dying corn. The next day, the Steiger still hadn't moved. I was cultivating near the fence line when Dale walked over. He looked haggard, his face smudged with grease and etched with fatigue. He had that look I knew so well, the look of a man being beaten by his own machinery. "What's the trouble?" I asked, pulling the throttle back on the deer until it settled into a low, rumbling idle. "Hydraulics," he said, kicking at a dirt clod with the toe of his boot. A main pump in the articulation joint went out. Took the whole steering system with it. The dealer says the part has to come from Fargo. Might take a week. A week. He waved a frustrated hand at the brassy, unforgiving sky. "I've got 1,000 acres to cultivate, and it's burning up out there." "That's a tough break," I said, and I meant it. In the field, you never wished bad luck on another farmer, no matter your differences. We were all at the mercy of the same weather, the same markets. "Tough doesn't begin to cover it," he snapped. "They're telling me the pump alone is $4,000. $4,000, plus 2 mechanics at $50 an hour each, plus mileage. It's robbery." I thought about the $50 clutch housing I'd pulled from a junked tractor myself, my own time the only labor cost. I didn't say anything. There was nothing to say that wouldn't sound like gloating. "How do you do it, Frank?" he asked, his voice softer now, the anger draining out of him, replaced by a raw weariness. "How do you keep this old junk running?" He gestured toward my 4020, chugging away faithfully, a plume of dark smoke puffing from its stack as it idled. "I just know it, I guess," I said. "Every bolt and every wire. There's nothing on it I can't fix with a set of wrenches and my I&T manual." He just shook his head, a look of profound exhaustion on his face. "This thing," he said, pointing at the silent green monster in his field, "it's got more wiring than a telephone exchange, more hydraulic lines than a hospital. It's too damn complicated. When it works, it's a miracle. When it breaks—" He trailed off, staring at the heat shimmering off the tractor's hood. "I gotta go call the bank," he muttered, more to himself than to me, and walked away. That was the first real crack I saw, not just in the machine, but in the man. The farmer of the future was being brought to his knees by the very complexity he had embraced. His cutting-edge technology had become an anchor, a cash-devouring beast he couldn't control or understand. While his $4,000 pump was being shipped across the country, I finished my cultivating, parked the 4020 in the shed, and prayed for rain. The rain never came. The drought of 1980 was just one more nail in a coffin that was already being built. The drought broke that fall, but it was too little, too late. Yields were down by half across the county. Combined with the collapsed prices, it meant a catastrophic loss for anyone with a heavy debt load. The winter of '81 was grim. The prime rate, the number that governed all our loans, hit 20%, then 21.5%. It was an impossible, suffocating number, an act of economic violence. Variable rate loans that had been written at a comfortable 8% were now demanding 20+% interest. The math simply didn't work. You couldn't grow corn and pay that kind of vig. It was like trying to fill a bucket that had a hole in the bottom the size of your fist. The notices started appearing, tacked to fence posts and the glass door of the county courthouse. Foreclosure auctions. First, it was the young guys, the ones who had just started, full of hope and bank money. Then it was established names, families who had farmed the same ground for 100 years. The weekly paper grew thick with auction announcements, black-bordered advertisements that read like obituaries. It was a plague sweeping through the Corn Belt. Mr. Harrison, the banker, wasn't smiling anymore. His face, when you saw him in town, was a granite mask. He was no longer the friendly partner in progress. He was the executioner. He was just doing his job, people said, protecting the bank's assets. But he was tearing the heart out of our community, one farm at a time. Dale Peterson fought it for as long as he could. He sold off some of the newer equipment, trying to raise cash. He sold a quarter section of land to an out-of-state insurance company, a move that was once unthinkable, a sin in the farmer's Bible. But it was never enough. The interest payments were a monster that ate everything he threw at it, and only grew hungrier. He was selling his seed corn to pay the interest on the land he could no longer afford to plant. The end came in the summer of 1983. That's when the auction bills for the Peterson farm went up, their stark black lettering a final surrender. The day of the auction was the one I remember, the one that started this story. Seeing that massive Steiger, his symbol of ultimate power and progress, hooked to a tow truck, its engine blown to pieces. Dale had pushed it too hard, running it day and night, trying to get one more crop in, trying to outrun the bank. The big Cummins V8 had finally given up, a metal rod punching through the engine block like a fist through a plaster wall. It was a fitting, brutal end for a machine that had promised so much and delivered only ruin. I stood in the crowd and watched as his whole life was sold. The Gleaner combine, the big Kinzer planter, the fleet of shiny red International tractors. They all went for pennies on the dollar. The crowd was mostly other farmers, their faces etched with a terrifying mixture of pity and fear. The terrifying thought, this could be me next. There was no joy, no thrill of the bargain. It was a funeral for a farm. When it was over, Dale stood alone by the empty, cavernous machine shed. His wife and kids were gone, already moved in with her parents in town. Harrison and the bankmen were in the house, counting their money, their faces grim. They hadn't gotten nearly what they'd hoped for. Even the winners were losers that day. I walked over to Dale. The silence was heavy between us. "I'm sorry" felt hollow and useless. He looked up at me, and his eyes were empty, burned out. "You were right, Frank," he said, his voice a dry rasp. "You were right all along." "It wasn't about being right, Dale," I said, my own voice thick. "It was just a different way." "No," he said, shaking his head slowly. You knew debt was a trap. Harrison, the university guys, the magazines. They all told me I was a genius, a pioneer." A bitter, broken laugh escaped his lips, a sound with no humor in it. "They sold me a dream, Frank. And I bought it. I bought all of it." He looked down at his hands, calloused and stained from a life of hard work. "And now I have nothing. Less than nothing." He turned and walked toward his pickup truck, the last thing he owned that the bank hadn't taken. As he drove away, a cloud of dust rising from the gravel lane he would never drive down again. I felt no sense of victory, no vindication, just a profound and terrible sadness for him, for his family, for all of us. The future he had represented was gone, sold for scrap, and the past, my past of old iron and stubborn caution, was all that was left standing in the wreckage. The auction didn't end things. The bank took possession of Dale's land, all 1,500 acres he had owned. They tried to sell it as a single package, but in that economy there were no buyers. No one had the money or the nerve. The farmstead sat empty for a year. The weeds grew up around the house where Judy had planted her roses. The paint on the barn started to peel, and the windows of the house stared out like vacant eyes. It was a ghost haunting the landscape, a monument to a broken dream. I kept farming my 320 acres. I had money in the bank, the cash I'd saved during the good years. It wasn't a fortune, but in the land of the blind, the one-eyed man is king. It was a shield. While my neighbors were struggling to make their interest payments, I was buying seed and fuel. My old 4020 and the 4430 never seemed more beautiful to me. Their faded paint and dented fenders were badges of honor. They were mine. Every clank of the transmission and every groan of the hydraulics was the sound of freedom. One day, Mr. Harrison called me. His voice was different now, stripped of its easy confidence, replaced by a thin, weary tone. "Frank," he said, "the board wants to liquidate the Peterson property. We're breaking it up. I know you're in a good cash position. We'd be willing to make you a very attractive offer on the 160 acres that adjoin your farm." The home place. The irony was thick enough to choke on. The same man who had once called me a fool for not taking on debt was now begging me to buy the wreckage left by his star client. I thought about it long and hard. I didn't need more land. But the thought of that house sitting empty, of that barn falling in on itself, it bothered me. It was good land, worked by the same family for 3 generations before Dale took it over. It deserved better. "I'll buy it," I told him, "but I have a condition." There was a pause on the line. "What is it?" he asked, his voice wary. "I want to buy it on a contract, direct from the bank," I said, "and I'm paying the price it's worth today, not the inflated price from 5 years ago." He agreed without a fight. The bank was desperate. I wrote a check for the down payment, a sum that would have been unthinkable just a few years prior, but felt manageable now. I didn't go to the bank for a loan. I used my own savings. The first thing I did after the papers were signed was drive into town. I found Dale working at the local tire shop, wrestling heavy tractor tires for other farmers. It was humbling, brutal work. He was covered in black grime, his face thinner, but his hands were still strong. I told him about the land. "I'm not going to live there, Dale," I said. "Sarah and I are fine where we are. The house needs a family in it. I want you and Judy and the kids to move back in." He stared at me, his eyes wide with disbelief, a flicker of something I hadn't seen in years. "Frank, I can't pay you rent. I can barely feed my family as it is." "I'm not asking for rent," I said. "I'm offering you a job. I need a hand. This is more land than I can handle by myself. I'll pay you a fair wage. You live in the house as part of the deal. You take care of the place, you help me farm it. We'll make it work." Tears welled up in his eyes, the first real emotion I'd seen from him since the auction. He tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. He just nodded, wiping his greasy hand across his face before he reached out and shook mine. The community watched, dumbfounded. The story went around the coffee shop like wildfire. Frank Miller, the man who never took a risk, had just bought out his rival. But they got the story wrong. I hadn't bought him out. I was just trying to put a piece of our world back together. Dale and I farmed together for the next 15 years. We were a strange pair. I was the cautious one, checking the oil twice and always listening for a strange noise. He was the one who always wanted to push a little harder, go a little faster. But the swagger was gone, replaced by a hard-won wisdom. He learned the inner workings of my old John Deere's, becoming as good a mechanic as I was. I learned from him about new seed hybrids and marketing strategies he'd picked up in his high-flying days. We found a balance. The farm prospered, slowly and steadily. We never borrowed another dime from the bank. My son Tom grew up during those years. He saw it all. He spent his summers on the fender of the 4020 and later in the cab of the 4430. He learned how to change oil, how to grease fittings, how to listen to an engine and know when something was wrong. He also learned how to read a balance sheet and to respect the red ink on the page. I'll never forget the day he came home from college with his new agriculture degree, full of new ideas. He was about the same age I was when I bought the 4020. "Dad," he said, spreading a glossy brochure for a new John Deere 8000 series tractor on the kitchen table. "Look at this. GPS guidance, 200 horsepower, air ride seat, climate-controlled cab. We could replace both the 4020 and the 4430 with this one machine. It would make us so much more efficient." I looked at the picture. It was a beautiful machine, a green spaceship like Dale's had once been. It probably cost more than my entire farm was worth in 1971. "How are we going to pay for it, son?" I asked quietly. "Well, we'd have to get a loan," he said, his voice full of youthful confidence. "But with today's prices and the efficiency gains—" I got up from the table and walked out to the machine shed, the screen door slapping shut behind me. Tom followed. I laid my hand on the hood of the 4020. The steel was cool under my palm. It had been repainted once, a cheap job I'd done myself, but the dents and scars were still there, each one a memory, a lesson paid for in sweat. "This tractor," I said, my voice thick with an emotion that surprised me, "is the reason you got to go to college. It's the reason we still have this farm. It's not about efficiency, Tom. It's about resilience. It's about owning what you have, and not letting what you have own you." I told him the whole story then. About Dale, about the Steiger, about the boom and the bust. I told him about the night I split the tractor in half to fix the transmission while his mother held the trouble light. I told him about the banker's easy smile and the auctioneer's final cry. He listened, his eyes fixed on the old green tractor. When I was finished, there was a long silence. The only sound was the cooing of pigeons in the high rafters of the barn. "I get it, Dad," he finally said, his voice quiet. "I get it now." He never mentioned the new tractor again. Today he runs the farm. He's added some newer equipment over the years, all of it bought used, all of it paid for with cash from a good year's crop. But the old 4020 still sits in the front of the shed. He takes it out once in a while to rake hay or pull a wagon. He says it keeps him honest. Sometimes, in the quiet of a summer evening, I'll walk out to the edge of the yard and look out over the fields. The land I bought from the bank is indistinguishable now from the land my father left me. It's all just one place, healed over. Dale's grandson is over there, playing catch with my grandson in the yard of the house he almost lost. I think about Dale's words that day at the auction. "You were right." But it was never about being right. It was about surviving. The boom years were a fever dream, a grand illusion that convinced good men that the laws of gravity no longer applied. They believed that debt was wealth and that bigger was always better. They forgot the simple, brutal truth of the soil. You reap what you sow. I just sowed a different kind of crop. I sowed caution and patience, and I reaped a harvest of peace of mind. And in the end, in the quiet heartland, that's the only harvest that truly matters.